You're listening to Switched On Australia, the podcast that tracks the opportunities and challenges of electrifying everything, everywhere. Switched On is brought to you by the publishers of Renew Economy, Australia's best informed, most read website focusing on the green energy transition, and is supported by Boundless Earth. Boundless Earth uses philanthropy, investment and direct advocacy to help Australia become a global force in a decarbonised world. Hello and welcome back to Switched On Australia. I'm Anne Delaney. It's great to have your company. Electricity bills. Why are they still going up, even as wholesale electricity prices plunge during the day, thanks to all the solar we've added to the grid? New modelling from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, IEEFA, finds that the real key to slashing household energy bills isn't more power plants or political debate about gas versus renewables, and it's not one-off bill rebates either. It's your home. IEEFA's latest analysis shows that smart home energy upgrades, like switching to efficient electric appliances, installing rooftop solar and batteries, and improving insulation, could cut household energy bills by 80 to 90%. In Sydney, the savings could be as high as 94%. Now that's huge. And it's not just households that win from home energy upgrades. Reducing energy demand at home means less pressure on the grid, lower gas use and fewer costly peaks for everyone. So what will it take to make this a reality, and why hasn't it happened already? To help us unpack all of this, I'm joined by Jay Gordon again, Energy Finance Analyst and author of IEEFA's new report. Jay, tell me, why are Australian households continuing to see rising energy bills when wholesale electricity prices are at record lows during the middle of the day?
Yeah. So essentially, you can think of there being a whole range of factors that are either putting pressure on those prices to come up or prices to come down. Now, as you mentioned, we've seen a pretty remarkable transition towards wind and solar energy in Australia over the last decade. And one of the effects of that has been that wholesale electricity prices in the middle of the day when solar is generating are very low. Unfortunately, some of the counteracting effects we have seen is a rise in fossil fuel prices and quite volatile fossil fuel prices at times. That's particularly the case for gas, which is actually a very big determinant of our electricity price. And we have also, of course, seen high costs associated with networks, so just the poles and wires to deliver electricity to homes. So, unfortunately, that's why we have seen, I think, a net gradual rise in prices over time, and why, even at the moment, we've got the energy regulator has, made that decision around the annual price rise that we see, and that is translating through to higher energy costs for a lot of people. The other factor behind all this is that there are a few reasons why we're actually just spending a lot of energy in our homes, and that's to do with the way that we use energy in the homes, and the fact that our homes are actually quite inefficient at times, or in a lot of regions we're quite reliant on gas, which is one of the most expensive forms of energy. And so there are some really key drivers like that, which mean that even when we do see pressures taking downward pressure on electricity prices, just the sheer amount of energy we're consuming is really contributing to very high energy costs.
And we'll look at some of that as we go along. But this new report that you've done argues that we've actually been trying to address rising energy costs with the wrong solutions. And we know that governments are concerned about this. Before we look at what the right solutions are, tell me, what are the wrong solutions?
Yeah, look, I mean, in our view, some of the responses we've seen are quite short-term in focus. So specifically in the past few years, the most common response that we've seen from federal and some state governments has been to provide one-off energy bill rebates. Now we know that through the data that we see from the RBA and others that these have had a real impact in reducing energy costs for households, and I know a lot of households have appreciated them. But the challenge with those solutions is, of course, they are temporary in nature, and so they can only be provided for so long. A one-off energy bill subsidy provided at a certain point in time will only have an impact at that point in time. And we see that as a bit of a missed opportunity to instead invest that money in solutions that we know could deliver permanent energy bill savings.
Mm.
So that's one area where we think the policy focus could be a bit more nuanced. And then, of course, I think we've seen some broader political debates that really sort of focused on questioning whether the rollout of renewables is the right thing, or we should be looking to alternatives. And I think a lot of the time those debates end up actually focusing on solutions that would be driving up the cost of energy when, as
Yes.
we know, it's
More
renewables are not the
gas.
problem. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. But why do you think things like short-term subsidies and, this perennial debate over the renewable rollout are dominating the discussion on solutions to rising costs instead of what, I'm sure we're going to go into, deeper structural issues?
Mm. It's a really good question, and I wonder if a lot of it is a sort of reflection of kind of the short-term nature of political cycles, where there's not always a very strong motivation for governments to be thinking about how these policies are going to be impacting people, say, more than 3 years into the future. Certainly, providing a direct energy bill subsidies is convenient in the sense that there will just be a line item that comes straight off people's next energy bill. Whereas, things like some of the options that we look at in our report, these home energy upgrades do require a bit more of an active effort to make changes to people's homes. And there's a strong case for accelerating that action to make sure you can build up the industry to support that. But it is in a lot of ways a longer term solution.
Mm.
Yeah, certainly. I think some of the debate around renewables and versus gas, or even things like nuclear, obviously becomes quite a political hot topic. And I just think that we've seen kind of a lot of that debate not necessarily focusing around the facts and the the underlying drivers of what are the really material things driving up energy costs. A lot of it is
Yeah.
just more playing into the political narrative, unfortunately.
So let's look at the facts and what would be better solutions for reducing the cost of electricity. Your new modelling has found some really interesting percentages.
Mm.
Tell me what some of these are, how we could really slash energy bills.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we really believe that sort of focusing on the way we use energy in our homes is a really underappreciated opportunity, and by far the most effective way we could reduce household energy bills. And so our report specifically looked at things like thermal efficiency upgrades, efficient electric appliances, rooftop solar, batteries, and even just shifting energy loads to different times of the day. And we found that a combination of even just some of those upgrades could achieve energy bill savings of 80 to 90% across the different capital cities where we modelled. And while that seems like a really extraordinary number, it really represents a situation where, firstly, if you're a home that's consuming gas, you're entirely eliminating your gas bill. But also you're using electricity much more efficiently, more smartly. And then, of course, capitalising on the energy you can produce from your own rooftop solar shared throughout the day with a battery.
So are any of those elements more effective than others?
It's an interesting question. We sort of found if you look across the different regions, the different balance between which options deliver more benefits kind of shifts around a bit. But it is a little bit of a case of the sum of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Mm-hmm.
That they all tend to interact with each other. So, the obvious examples of that are that, rooftop solar is very effective at helping you meet your energy demand in the middle of the day. And then the battery sort of just helps you shift that energy around to other times of the day and get more use out of it.
Mm.
But even, simply by switching your gas appliances to efficient electric appliances, that now means that you can power those appliances with your solar and your battery. And so there's a compounding effect there. And, just being able to use energy more efficiently in the household tends to mean you get better value out of these resources. So I think the way I often frame it is that, say efficient electric appliances are a pretty economical upgrade you can make straight away, even if you don't have rooftop solar and a battery. But no matter what way you sort of get to that end point, the more of these upgrades you can implement, the lower your energy bills end up being.
Can we just look at a couple of specifics? I mean, you found that the greatest savings from, doing the appliance upgrades, the rooftop solar and batteries, The greatest savings could be made in Sydney, where bills could be slashed by 94%, which is quite phenomenal.
Mm.
And the least, but obviously still really significant, was in Melbourne, where they could be slashed by 82%. Now, can you explain why that is? Because I would have thought that the savings in Melbourne, where they have a much higher use of gas,
Mm.
would be greater by coming off that gas.
Yeah, it's really interesting, some of these regional differences. So what we see in Melbourne is, as you say, there is actually a very significant benefit coming off gas. And in the case of Melbourne, that means that the efficient electric appliances are actually the most significant saving there,
Mm-hmm.
which gets you to about, I think, the $1,400 a year if you're able to switch off those gas appliances to efficient electric alternatives. The reason you don't quite get to the 90% in Melbourne is because it's sort of, you've got quite a cool climate there. And so if you imagine in winter, if you've got electric heating now you switched off gas, you might have not as much solar output as you do at other times of the year. So we do tend to find this means Melbourne households in our model are drawing a little bit more from the grid than in other regions, just because there's sort of more competition, I suppose, for the rooftop solar in the middle of the day. Although we do sort of find a few strategies that would be good at managing that, and a few ways that you can improve that. Certainly, thermal efficiency upgrades are a really great way you could reduce your heating load and get more value out of your solar. But yeah, it's a sort of an interesting finding which highlights some of the challenges and opportunities that you might see in Melbourne as we have a shift away from gas.
Now, batteries are obviously the appliance of the moment, with the federal government's rebate kicking in a couple of weeks ago. What did your modelling find specifically about batteries? If we take a 10 kilowatt an hour battery, which is probably the average, if we add that to a home with solar and efficient electric appliances.
Yeah, so batteries are pretty effective. Essentially, they're sort of like your last mile thing, where you've got using efficient electricity. Your rooftop solar is helping power that in the middle of the day, and so batteries are really about making better use of that solar to meet your overnight or your evening demand, and that is significant because especially the early evening tends to be when electricity demand peaks in our homes. And so we found that in most regions, if you were to take a typical day throughout most months of the year, an 8 kilowatt solar system and a 10 kilowatt hour battery, which you say is a pretty average size, would be enough to essentially meet almost all of your energy needs throughout the day. Now, of course, we know not every day is typical. You might have days that where the solar is a bit lower than normal or demand is a bit higher, and you have some falling back on the grid. But it was really sort of stood out to us just how much energy demand could potentially come off the grid when you've got these batteries being installed. And again, really significant because a lot of that is happening during the evening peak period, which is when the grid is potentially close to its maximum amount of load.
Now, obviously, the figures, some of these high percentage savings that you've identified, are dependent on homes being thermally efficient, and that includes the insulation, the draft proofing, etc. Because essentially, you don't need as much energy if your home is thermally efficient. But is it really possible to retrofit these homes at scale to get the sort of energy savings you've modelled?
Yeah, so the thermal efficiency piece is a really interesting one. What we did find is that those sort of 80 to 90% reductions essentially were possible with just the appliances and solar and batteries. So they're reductions that can be achieved sort of exclusive of thermal efficiency upgrades. But absolutely, like when you can upgrade the thermal efficiency of the house, this just compounds with all other savings. And so we see if you take Melbourne, for example, where, the average house is probably a sort of 2-star rating on the 10-star scale. By the time you can upgrade that, if you were to upgrade that to a 7-star house, you're looking at reducing energy consumption by just over a third, even before looking at other upgrades. So the potential is very significant. I think you're right that it might not necessarily be realistic to think we can upgrade every house in Australia to be 7 stars. But I think the really important thing to note with these upgrades is that you could be looking at a very sort of wide range of different options. So between things like, topping up your ceiling insulation or sort of sealing your gaps or, doing double glazing, all of these different types of upgrades. Most households will have certain upgrades that are definitely on the lower cost of that spectrum. So it tends to be sort of sealing your drafts and sealing up gaps and the ceiling insulation. They tend to be sort of on the lower cost, most cost-effective end of the scale. So, well, I think the data around sort of the cost and effectiveness of these is not always exactly where we would like it to be. I tend to think that a focus on kind of working your way up through some of the lowest cost upgrades is probably going to be an effective strategy for most households.
Yeah, because many households really, they simply don't have the time, the knowledge, or the bandwidth to make some of these optimal energy decisions. Is it enough for governments to just offer rebates, or do we need to radically rethink the consumer experience altogether?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think we've seen there are a lot of regions now, not all unfortunately, but some regions where there are quite strong rebate programs, and they will go some way to accelerating uptake. So I think in Victoria, for example, there are quite strong rebates around electrification now, and we have seen that drive fairly significant uptake in houses switching off gas heating, for example. But of course, there are essentially a lot of households that those rebates don't necessarily reach. So, of course, that's the households that don't have the option to upgrade, like renters who can't make those investment decisions themselves. There might still be households that struggle with the upfront costs or simply, like you said, just don't have the time and bandwidth to be making those sorts of optimal decisions. And for those groups, we feel quite strongly that there's a need for government to look at some of our minimum standards for appliances.
Hmm.
And this is a topic we've covered before, but essentially, Australia has an existing federal government program around appliance standards. So a lot of the infrastructure is there, but we think it's in need of an update and in need of broadening to have essentially a targeted focus on making sure that we can accelerate the uptake of efficient electric appliances in homes. And this is important to have sort of a broad scheme like that because it means targeting rental properties as much as you are owner-occupier properties. And as we know, there's often very, very few solutions out there that really target the rental properties.
Yeah. Which appliances would you put the focus on? I'm presuming hot water heat pumps.
Yes, absolutely. Heat pump hot water systems and also reverse cycle air conditioners for heating, which is always an interesting one because I think a lot of people now have reverse cycle air conditioners for cooling. Like it's pretty standard, but for various reasons we have a legacy of using a lot of gas heating in places like Victoria and other forms of inefficient heating in other regions. So I think there's still quite a strong need to accelerate the uptake of those reverse cycle air conditioners for heating because they are the most efficient form of heating.
Definitely. Now, just to, I suppose, for the record, I mean, household energy upgrades don't actually only benefit the householder, do they? Because there's also a benefit for other energy users.
Yeah, absolutely. And this comes down to what we were touching on before around when the peak demand on the grid occurs. So if we look at kind of the way investment is made in our energy system, whether that's investment in new generators and power plants or transmission and distribution power lines to deliver energy to our homes, that system is basically designed around reliably delivering energy during the most trying conditions on the grid. So during conditions where electricity demand is at its absolute highest, which in most parts of Australia tends to be on very hot summer days or summer afternoons and evenings when air conditioning demand is very high. And so what that means is a really key way to reduce those system costs is to focus on how can we reduce demand during those peak periods. And many of the upgrades that we focused on here provide an option to do that or provide options to help shift around demand and to manage that impact on during peak times.
Just on that issue of rebates, do you think Australia should move more towards a more holistic household electrification package, kind of like a Medicare for energy upgrades that actually bundles insulation, efficient appliances, rooftop solar, batteries, all these things that you've been modelling under one policy roof?
Yeah, I do think there's a bit of a case for that, because at the moment, if we look at the federal rebate schemes, they are quite targeted on specific technologies. So there's most people are aware there's a long-standing rebate for rooftop solar. That same scheme also provides a small rebate for heat pump hot water systems, and now, of course, very recently, batteries. And there's obviously a strong justification behind providing rebates for those technologies in terms of the energy bill savings they deliver, and particularly in the case of batteries, as we'll get to, some of the impacts on electricity during peak periods. But what we suggest is that actually there's a much broader range of upgrades that provide these sorts of benefits. And so, yeah, our suggestion would be that rather than having these federal rebates just target quite specific technologies, it might be more appropriate to have a broader rebate scheme where, yeah, as you say, it will value things like topping up your insulation or installing other forms of efficient electric appliances where these deliver some of the same benefits that solar and batteries and heat pump hot water systems also deliver.
I mean, some states are moving faster, aren't they, on home energy upgrades? I mean, ACT and Victoria. Do you think that this is going to create real disparities across the country?
Yeah, it is a bit of concern, and I think there is a disparity at the moment. For example, look at installing things like heat pump hot water systems or reverse cycle air conditioners. If you're somewhere like Victoria, like the amount of rebates you get when you sort of add the available federal rebates and the state rebates is very significant, to the point where in Victoria now, it's often the case that the efficient electric appliances might cost less than if you were to buy new gas appliances.
Mm.
And now that's sort of a really good position to be in to drive uptake of those appliances. But yeah, it does create a very stark difference if you're in really the majority of other states and territories that don't have any form of state rebates. So, I think outside of Victoria and New South Wales and South Australia, there's really no other rebates available for reverse cycle air conditioners in most cases. Even within some of the state rebate schemes, it's pretty inconsistent as to whether they'll cover thermal efficiency upgrades and insulation. So, yeah, it does become a bit of a patchwork, and that's why I think a consistent federal approach would be really helpful.
I mean, should it be top down from the federal government or a big stick to encourage the states to get the other states that aren't doing enough to get cracking?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways it could happen. So, certainly like something top down would work, and we do have some of that infrastructure there in the form of the rebate programs for solar and batteries that could potentially be broadened out to cover some of these other upgrades. I think if we think of things being as efficient as possible, it's probably would be ideal to have that federal program rather than have every state try and replicate it themselves.
Mm.
But there might be a case to say, well, okay, can we look at what Victoria has done, for example, or what New South Wales has done, and is this a model of a program that could be extended out nationally? So there might be a case to sort of draw on those existing state schemes and learn from that. But I think you would ideally like to see something sort of more federal and coordinated. And then within that, there might still be a case for some states to look at, where they might have quite specific challenges they're grappling with. For example, Victoria around electrification, maybe it does make sense for them to have their own particular targeted rebates that are supporting those particular challenges.
Because you do want to enable states to be, given that they do have these geographical differences when it comes to energy needs. You do want to take account of that, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And like the Victorian electrification situation is obviously the best example of that that I can think of, where there is a bit of an imperative for that state to reduce gas demand, to deal with upcoming gas supply gaps. And, that will carry its own sort of unique challenges as to how that's managed. But I think, really important to not lose the sight of the fact that there's some of the benefits of these upgrades, and particularly the energy bill savings that can be achieved, are pretty universal across states and territories. Like I said, you'll get a bit of variation here and there, but generally speaking, these upgrades are things that save money for everyone.
I mean, we can't really talk about electricity prices though, Jay, surely. Without actually talking about network costs, because
Mm.
no matter what we do in our homes to try and reduce our energy consumption, we can do our energy upgrades, we can put the solar on, we can put the batteries on. That's all to do with what we consume. And clearly, what you're saying from your modelling is really important. But we're still going to be lobbed with a network charge, aren't we? No matter how much we save and don't consume.
Yeah, and this is a really big topic at the moment, I think. So one thing I'd say that stands out from the modelling to me is that if you are a household that has kind of taken all those steps, and you've got solar and you've got a battery and you're using electricity efficiently, you can be in a situation where you're really drastically reducing your reliance on grid electricity. Now, as you said, you'll still be paying in that situation some kind of charge through your the fixed annual portion of your electricity bill, which will include some network charges. But at the same time, network costs are actually built into both that fixed charge and both the rate that you pay per unit of energy you consume. So there is a valid point to say, oh, okay, well, these users are suddenly paying a lot less for the networks, and what does that mean for everyone else? The risk that comes out of this is essentially that if you have a lot of those users coming off the network, or largely coming off the network, does that mean that the costs get transferred to the other people who are still paying for electricity? If we look at the way networks are regulated at the moment, the sort of status quo situation is that, yes, that is a genuine risk that could occur. The challenge that I sort of would pose to regulators and governments coming out of this is that if we're really facing a situation where households are really changing the ways they interact with electricity networks, and they might be using those networks a lot less, or they might be using them for different services like importing and exporting to their battery, this should actually be an opportunity, because it represents an opportunity to use the infrastructure we have more efficiently, and also to avoid the need to build a lot more of that capacity in future. So it's essentially we're reducing utilization across the electricity network. But I think we would need to see some fairly significant reforms of the way networks are regulated, if we want to make sure that those benefits can pass through to consumers, rather than just assuming, oh, no, we've got to recover the full cost of the network no matter what, and we're just transferring that to different groups of consumers.
Because I can see a situation where, people do embrace this opportunity to make these incredible savings by doing the energy upgrades and putting the solar and the batteries on, but, still hit with these same network charges. If we're still hit with those charges, it's an incredibly big disincentive.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, there's, again, if you assume that consumers are going to have to pay down this cost of the network somehow, and, we just focus on sort of how that's shared between different consumer groups, you don't really want to have a situation where we're just having people pay the network cost for the sake of it. I think the worldview that I would have, which would be preferable, is that you have your consumer, who might have solar and batteries, and essentially, they're probably now using the network for one of three things. So one is to have that there as a backup. If you do have a day with challenging conditions and you do need to draw on the grid, some people might just inherently value having access to the network to do that. You might also be, as we mentioned, sort of importing energy to your battery during the middle of the day, which we found was quite helpful in some regions, or exporting from your battery to the grid during peak times, which can be quite helpful for the energy system. And so I think we need to think about, okay, well, what's the value of these services, and the services that either the network is providing to the customer, or in some cases that the customer is providing to the system. The way we are currently regulating electricity networks essentially had no foresight that we would be installing these types of technologies and making these types of decisions. So it really is the kind of first principles review of networks that I think needs to be done to think about how we actually properly value these and don't create disincentives for consumers to implement these solutions, which should be reducing their bills and should be helping the energy system.
So in addition to that network review, just very quickly in summary, what would you like to see done as a matter of urgency to enable consumers to really drop their electricity prices?
Yeah. So I suppose in addition to that broader review, it would be really, I think it's really important to make sure that we've got, say, like pricing structures and programs that help reward consumers for using their equipment in a way that supports the grid. And the example of this would be around batteries. And so, as I mentioned, it's quite beneficial to be able to export excess power from your battery in the evening period. This helps, lower costs across, or should in theory lower costs across the grid for all users. But at the moment, if you're just on a typical electricity plan, even if it's on a time of use plan, there's actually not really much of an incentive to do that.
Mm.
And so there's a few options. I mean, you can sign up to what's called a virtual power plant, where essentially another external operator will manage how the battery is charging or discharging to the grid, and will provide you some kind of incentive structure or reward for that. But we think there's a need to sort of make sure that those programs are regulated well, so that we can be sure that a consumer signing up to that knows that they're going to get value out of it.
Yeah.
And there might just be a case for having better pricing plans and better structures that are designed in a way that can deliver those rewards to consumers, of course, without making it overly complicated or potentially punishing them for ways that should be beneficial to use that battery.
Yeah, definitely. Jay Gordon, thanks so much for joining the Switched On podcast again.
Thanks very much for having me.
And Jay Gordon is an Energy Finance Analyst at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, specialising in Australia's electricity market. You can find his full report, A Focus on Homes, Not Power Plants, on the IEEFA website. Next week on Switch On Australia, we'll be continuing our community battery series. I'll be speaking with a local group about to switch on their second battery. And the one piece of advice they have for any community wanting to build one, you'll have to listen to find out. I hope you can join me for that. I'm Anne Delaney. Till then, take care.